Hey guys, welcome back. In this lesson I will show you how to use Boto3 library to create Amazon S3 buckets using clients and resources. And of course during this lesson we will cover our code base with unit tests, which will validate that our code is working before we will actually execute it in a real environment. So let's get started. First of all, we need to create a separate folder for our S3 lessons. And within this folder, we will create a subfolder which will contain examples for this specific lesson. Let's call the folder like create S3 bucket examples. Okay, cool. Within this folder, let's create the actual Python script, which we will call create S3 bucket client to just show that we will use Boto3 client. And let's start from the things which I'm doing every single time. First of all, we need to put this shebang string to tell the shell that basically we are going to use Python to execute the file content that is required if you would like to make the script executable. So basically my favorite way of doing this is to doing something like use a bin, then env and Python. This shebang string return the path to the Python executable, which is specified in my operation system environment. And now I need, or it is generally good practice to provide the doc string for the file, which will tell our future developers who are gonna patch our script afterwards that what this script was all about. So this script creates S3 bucket using Boto3 client. Now, as soon as we did it, I recommend import Boto3 library, and now we need to find information how to do it in Boto3 documentation. So let's open an official Boto3 documentation, then go to available services, then search for S3 and go there. As soon as we are going to use client, we will click on the client. Of course, here we see initialization string. Let's copy this and put to our script. I don't want to type it. And now we need to find a method which is responsible for creating bucket. As soon as all the method names are self-explanatory, we are clicking this create bucket method. And let's scroll down to see what arguments does this method have. Of course, in our simple example, we will just simply create an S3 bucket in specific AWS region. To do this, we will use just only these two parameters, like the bucket and bucket configuration, which will specify the location constraint or the exact AWS region where the bucket should be located. If you need to use all other parameters, feel free to read the entire documentation and the information about the parameters down below. So what I'm gonna do, I would like to copy this example and put it here. Now, as soon as we have everything in place, copy it from documentation, now we can basically create a method which will be responsible for creating an S3 bucket. And it's a good way to basically wrap up everything with the method logic. So let's define our method. Let's call it create S3 bucket using client. And as I already mentioned, we will set up just only two arguments here, bucket name and AWS region. We will accept those parameters for the method. Now, what we can do, we can move all these examples to our method, slightly adjust the indentation, and now I suggest us to create a default global variables or global variables which will contain the default bucket name in AWS region, just in case. So let's call it like bucket name. The bucket name will be hands-on cloud demo bucket Boto3 client, and AWS region will be of course, let's do it normal Python way, like US West 2, for example. Cool. Now let's adjust our logic here. So first of all, I mean, it definitely makes sense to rename the client variable, just because whenever you are interacting with different AWS services using clients and resources, in the resources it makes sense to keep the meaningful name of these resources. So in my case, let's rename it to S3 client. And of course, almost instantly we see that we need to change this variable name as well. And now we fix the first error, right? Next, let's remove all unneeded arguments for create bucket method, and change the bucket string name to actual variable name, bucket name, which will come from input parameters for the method. And here, bucket configuration. Let's remove all these AWS regions and use AWS region variable, which will store our AWS region as soon as we will call this method. And what I suggest us to do in addition to that, I would like to remove this dictionary from here and put it somewhere here, like S3 bucket location equals and our dictionary. Cool. And now, instead of specifying entire dictionary here, we can use just a variable which contains our dictionary. That simplifies the readability of our code a little bit. Okay, and finally, let's return the response object or response dictionary back from the method, just in case if somebody would like to use it afterwards. Of course, we can specify the docstring for this specific method. Probably we need to do this. Let's do it very quick. And this method creates S3 bucket using Boto3 client. Okay, and here we go. It looks like we just defined the method which will create an S3 bucket for us. Now, as soon as we are planning to execute the script as a standalone script, probably it makes sense to define a main method. So the default syntax here will be if name equals underscore main underscore, and then all we need to do here is to call our method. Here we go. And as this method expects a couple of parameters, which should be a bucket name and our AWS region, and we are providing them from our global variables. Now let's print that basically AWS S3 bucket with the following name has been created. Cool. It looks like our script is ready, right? So we have like a couple of options to test it. We can execute the script right now and just make sure that the bucket has been created in our real AWS account, or we can write a unit test to do that. To write a unit test and test our code base before executing it in the real environment, we need to use a moto library. To do that, make sure that you activated your virtual environment, and you need to type first of all pip install moto command, which will install moto library, which is required for unit testing of the code related to Boto3 library. As you can see, I already have it installed, and basically the process finished very quickly. Now, what we can do, we can start defining our unit test. So in our bucket where our script is located, I would like to create a new file, and I will call this file test, just to show that this file contains unit test for one of our files, and then I will use the same file, file name as I used over here. So it's gonna be create S3 bucket client py, and that gives me an idea that this code located in this specific file will test that specific Python script logic. Cool. What we're gonna do here, we will start doing pretty similar things. We will start with Chopin, user bin, and then Python. Now, let's provide a doc string here. So to do that, we will type something like this: script will test method which creates AWS S3 bucket using Boto3 client. Okay, cool. Now we are ready to start defining our unit test. So first of all, we need to import the unit testing library or module from Python, and it's called unit test. Next, we will need a moto library itself, and we will need Boto3 library. And now we can start defining our test class. Let's call it class, and any test class should start from test keyword, then test, let's call the class create, like test create S3 bucket, and this class should inherit unit test test case class. Now, within this class, we need to define a setup method which will initialize the S3 client for our unit test, and that's gonna be setup method, def setup method, which will be defined like this, using self as an argument for this method. Now here we will use self S3 client and initialize the Boto3 client, and we will use an S3 service. Cool. Now we need to actually define a method which will test the logic of our create S3 bucket using client method. So to do that, we will use another definition of the method. Now we will call this method test, and again, this is required. We have to start all our test methods using test keyword. So let's call test create stream bucket using client, and use the self keyword here as well. Now, within this method, we need to import the method from our create S3 bucket client script, right? So let's do it from and our file name create S3 bucket client. We need to import our create S3 bucket using client method. Now, what we can do, we can specify the bucket name and bucket region. Let's do it like bucket name will be something like XYZ, for example, and AWS region will be something like EP South 1. Okay, so as soon as we define the arguments for our method, we can use it here and provide the required arguments for the method. Okay, as soon as we did it, we need to check that this method actually created something in AWS, right? So to do that, we need to, the best way to do it is to list all the buckets in our account and just find that one of them contains the bucket with this name, right? So let's do it. To do it, we need to use list bucket method. So let's go to the bucket, to Boto3 documentation. Let's go to the client and find the list bucket method. List buckets, it is called. Okay, so here is the syntax for the method call, and let's use it here. So instead of the client, we need to use self S3 client, which we set up in the setup method. And now the response object will contain a list of all S3 buckets. All S3 buckets. Now, let's take a look what or how the method response will look like. It's gonna be a Python dictionary, which will contain a key buckets, and these key buckets will contain a list of S3 buckets defined in our account. And the name will be the actual bucket name, and the creation date will be a creation date of the bucket. So we will rely on this bucket name to check basically that we created our bucket successfully. So to do that, let's create the buckets list and get a list of all the S3 buckets from this part of the response object. To do that, we need to do something like list. Then within the list, we need to define a for loop for bucket in response. Within the response, we need to get access to this bucket key. And now the bucket variable will contain this part, right? And we are interested in this name. So here, what we can do, we can type bucket and name. Okay, let's prettify it a little bit. Okay, now the buckets list will contain just only names of all buckets returned from the list buckets method, right? Finally, we can use assert in a method to check that this list, buckets list, actually contain the bucket name. So to do that, we need to use self keyword, then assert in. And here we need to use bucket name and provide the list of buckets. So at this moment of time, we should be good. And if our unit test executes successfully, that means that our code should work in our real AWS environment. And the last thing which we need to do is to use a mock decorator, which will basically make required changes in S3 client and force it to basically interact with in-memory emulated AWS methods instead of using network to reach out a real AWS API over the network. So to do that, we need to use mock S3 decorator. Okay, so at this moment of time, we should be good, but instead of mock, we need to use moto S3 decorator. Okay, cool. So now we can execute the test and see if it is actually working. So to do that, let's jump to our folder. We are jumping to Python Boto3 course, then S3 lessons, and then create S3 bucket. And now let's call Python and call our test to see if it is actually working. Okay, nothing is shown just because we did not specify the init method here. If name equals main, and within this method we need to call unit test main, and that will force basically Python to execute our unit test. Let's execute our test once more again, and here we go. Everything works. So now we can be sure that as soon as we run this script, we will be able to see the bucket with this name created in our AWS account. Let's check it out. So first of all, let me to show you that there is no such a bucket in my AWS account right now. And now let's execute our script. Python create S3 bucket client UI. AWS S3 bucket with this name has been created. Let's go back to AWS account, refresh the buckets list. Now it's 5 buckets here, and as you can see, the bucket just been created in a real environment. That's how we are creating a S3 bucket using client. Let's do something similar with Boto3 resource, right? So as soon as the amount of changes which we need to make to just adopt this script for using Boto3 resource will be very, very small. Let's just duplicate this file rename it to reflect our changes. And instead of client, we will use resource here. Let's close all these files. Open the S3 bucket resource file and start adopting it or making required changes to change the client to the resource. First thing first, we need to change the doc string here. Instead of client, we'll use resource. In the bucket name, it definitely makes sense to use resource. And now in the method itself, in the method name, let's change the client to the resource. Now in the doc string too. And now let's do required changes in the call base. So let's rename the variable. Now it will store S3 resource. The Boto3 will call resource factory method for the S3. Now the bucket location will remain the same. Now we see that first of all the S3 client isn't defined, and instead of the client we need to use the resource, right? But right after that we can either use a create bucket from the S3 resource with the same syntax, or we can create a bucket using slightly different way. So let's do it through the Boto3 bucket class. So first of all, let's define the bucket, and that's gonna be S3 resource bucket. And this class, let's find it in the documentation. So first of all, let's jump to the beginning of the documentation, go to the service resources, and go to the bucket. That's how we are defining bucket using resource. That will return us S3 bucket class object. So basically, let's define the bucket name from the input variables. Afterwards, we can use this class create method to actually create the bucket. Let's scroll down to the syntax and see how it is implemented. It is implemented in a similar way, but the bucket argument is missing over here. So all we need to do is just to leave this argument here. So let's use bucket here. Instead of create bucket, we will use just a create method from the bucket class. And we don't need this bucket argument here. The rest should be the same. The last change here, what I would like to recommend us to do is to remove the response to the bucket. And actually we don't need it anymore because we are going to return a bucket itself. Cool. So as a result, the method will use bucket class and create method from this bucket class with specified location constraint and return us the actual bucket object, just in case if somebody would like to use it in the future. And now all we need to do is to change the method name over here. The rest should be the same. That's how you're basically changing Boto3 client to Boto3 resource. We can do something similar in the opposite direction. Right now, again, let's create a unit test which will test our code base. To do that, let's clone this S3 bucket client test. File, duplicate. Let's rename it. Specify resource here. Close this file. Open test resource. And take a look what we need to do here. First of all, let's make renaming changes. Resource, we are changing the doc string first. Then everything else should stay the same. In setup method, instead of S3 client, we will use S3 resource. And we will use resource factory method instead of the client factory method of Boto3 library. Now, in the let's rename the test method itself. And we need to import the create S3 bucket using the resource method, which is located in a different file, which is called create S3 bucket resource. As I remember, yes. Next, we are leaving bucket name in AWS region as is. Then let's replace the method name over here. And now, as soon as we are using Boto3 resource, we need to rely on collections, which will return us a list of S3 buckets. Let's go to the documentation. Let's go back to the beginning of the file. Let's go to the service resource section and scroll over here to the section which describes the available collections. And as we can see, we have a buckets collection, and the all method within this buckets collection, which will return us a list of S3 buckets. So let's use it. And here, instead of using an S3 resource, we need to use self S3 resource first. We are using self S3 resource over here to get access to the buckets collection, and then call all method. And let's call this bucket iterator like buckets, and remove unnecessary string. Now we will use this buckets iterator to construct the buckets list. And here for every single bucket in returned by the buckets iterator from the buckets collection, we need to get access to the bucket name, right? So let's take a look how it or how it should looks like. So we need to go back to the actual bucket class and take a look that the class exposes the property name, and we can rely on it. So that's how we are constructing a list of buckets which will contain all the S3 buckets name from in-memory collection. And of course, the cert in will do the same thing. Basically, it will walk through all the elements in the buckets list and try to find the bucket name XYZ. So let's try to execute our script or test. Python create S3 bucket resource. No, first of all, we will execute the test. Which will test our resource. It looks like we wrote our script without any errors from the first attempt, which is good. And the test shows us that we can safely execute it in our AWS environment. Let's do it. Python, and then create S3 bucket using resource UI. The bucket with this specific name has been created. Let's go back to our AWS account, refresh the buckets list, and there are 6 buckets over here. And as you can see, the bucket has been created in our AWS account. Cool, that's exactly what we wanted as a result from this lesson. I wish you good luck with your Boto3 and Python automation journey, and see you in the next lesson.